What would you say if I told you that there was a book containing the secrets of the dark arts of alchemy and wizardry, a book that can literally reveal all the mysteries of the universe, a tome that threatens everything our entire civilization is founded upon? You'd say, yeah, right, but I bet you still want to see it. Throughout history, mysterious books and writings have caused panic and controversy. Some believe that in his book, the prophecies of Nostradamus predicted the rise of Hitler, the 9/11 attacks, and the end of the world. But there's another mysterious book that many believe contains other cataclysmic predictions. Its dark secrets are yet to be revealed. Historians, linguists, and code breakers are attempting to decipher its meaning. What will they reveal? Experts worldwide are obsessed by this item, MS 408, of the rare book and manuscript library at Yale University, its current home.
First impression was that it's extraordinarily bizarre, but that it's also oddly familiar. On one level, it looks like something you've seen before. But the more you look at it, the more you realize that it's really like nothing you've seen before. So it only gradually do you become aware that this isn't a normal kind of manuscript at all.
This mysterious book is better known as the Voynich manuscript. It was discovered in 1912 by rare book dealer Wilfrid Voynich in a Jesuit library near Rome. Its author has never been revealed. Nearly 100 years later, historians like Professor Nicholas Terpstra are still trying to decipher the manuscript's contents. Unidentifiable plants.
Are these the plants from the Garden of Eden?
Strange astrological symbols.
Is this somehow the astrology of another level of the universe?
And most mysterious of all, pages of text that 100 years later still remain undeciphered.
As you try to read the lettering, you realize that it's completely impossible to decipher. And if we can just break it out, we'll find the answer to everything.
A manuscript that promises to change the world and no one can read the thing? And if that wasn't enough, no bio on the back cover, no one knows who wrote it? So is there anything we do know about the Voynich manuscript? Well, in 2009, researchers at the University of Arizona carbon dated it and discovered it may have been produced in the first half of the 15th century. And that fact opens up a whole world of theories. You won't believe what I'm seeing here. What mysterious secrets does the Voynich manuscript contain? Could there be predictions like those of Nostradamus, prophesizing our doom? To begin, investigators needed to find out when it was written. In 2009, they got a significant clue. Researchers at the University of Arizona carbon dated the parchment. They discovered it might have been produced in the first half of the 15th century. Could this vital piece of evidence reveal the secrets of the Voynich manuscript? Medieval Europe was a continent emerging from the Dark Ages into a new dawn of innovation and discovery.
The early 15th century is a time of extraordinary expansion of people's creativity, curiosity. People were curious about all sorts of things in the world. There's a certain amount of political instability, but there's a lot of economic expansion, and merchants are going to all different parts of the world. There's also a real curiosity about learning, about particularly finding out what the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans knew and trying to take that knowledge and bring it back into contemporary society. So everybody thought that the way to the future lay through the past.
This new era of innovation fueled interest in more controversial beliefs like alchemy and other dark arts. Books were written which contained what many believed were ancient scientific or alchemical techniques. One of the most famous were Giambattista della Porta's Magia Naturalis.
Books of secrets were common at the time. The notion was that the only truths that are really important are the truths that aren't immediately apparent. So that true knowledge is secret knowledge. And the way to get secret knowledge was usually by revelation of some kind. So there's a whole tradition that goes back to the Greeks of books of secrets that explain then the secret knowledge of the universe, the secret connections within the universe, and then the way to probe this, to understand it, and normally then to try to work with it. So the whole idea of a book of secrets is that it's like a technical manual for controlling the powers of the universe.
But for a time, these ancient truths were heresy. To avoid persecution, many authors would find ways to disguise sensitive information in their writings.
So it tended to be the kind of things they wanted to hide for political purposes.
One of the most common forms of disguise was to compose in a language few people could read.
What you do find, there's a whole range of languages that people are rediscovering. This is the time period, early 15th century, when people are reacquainting themselves with things like Egyptian hieroglyphics and believe that hieroglyphics are the answer to finding out what true Egyptian knowledge was. This is a time when people are trying to find out what Etruscan looked like, ancient Etruscan. This is a time when people will actually invent languages, and 100 years later, you'll find somebody who invents a language from, supposedly the language from the ancient biblical times that was spoken by the angels. There's also a real curiosity about learning, about particularly finding out what the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans knew and trying to take that knowledge and bring it back into contemporary society. So everybody thought that the way to the future lay through the past. They're looking for ancient knowledge anywhere they can get it. The more ancient, the better.
You ever heard of a language called Eoc? Eoc. No. Eoc. See? I thought not. This was a language that was spoken by native Alaskans, and let me emphasize, was. In 2008, the last person who could speak Eoc died. Languages come and go. In fact, of the nearly 7,000 languages around the world today, 500 of them, that's 500 of them, are teetering on the edge of extinction. Is it possible that the Voynich manuscript is the remnant of a forgotten, extinct language? Is the Voynich manuscript a remnant of an ancient language rediscovered by a 15th century scholar? Stephen Chrysomalis is a linguistics expert.
Throughout history, there must have been tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of languages spoken, most of which are now long extinct. The Voynich manuscript is fascinating because it's so close to something that we could decipher and we could read. Many of the letters look like letters in the Roman alphabet, and yet, as soon as you get into it, it falls to pieces.
Linguists call the text found in the Voynich manuscript Voynichese. If it is indeed a language, its complex designs make Voynichese almost impossible to recognize. While it appears to have some familiar characters, what they mean and how they relate to each other has experts baffled.
In most languages, if you look at a page of text, the most common words in that text will be short. So if you were to go to your shelf and pick out a book, I can absolutely tell you with 100% certainty that the common words will be nice short words, the, a, of, it, etc. In the Voynich manuscript, the most common words aren't short words, and that's a mystery. That's one of the reasons why some scholars think that it in fact doesn't represent language at all, because it doesn't have lots and lots of those little short words that we find again and again and again in languages across the world. This is not just about English, but it's in fact a property of human language.
The Voynich manuscript seems as technically sophisticated as a real written language, but incredibly, it bears no resemblance to any other language that we know of. But some historians believe that was the intention, and the Voynich manuscript's unknown author didn't want its secrets revealed, ever. Could the secret knowledge within the Voynich manuscript have been disguised with a code, perhaps a medieval cipher text? Ah, damn it. You know what a cipher is, right? It's a way you can encrypt or decrypt something. You jumble things up to hide sensitive information. Have you ever done a cryptogram? Well, that's a cipher. Simple letter substitution game. Not for me, I suck at it.
The simplest type of code is a simple substitution cipher, where you take one letter of the alphabet and replace it with another. So A would be encoded by B, C, D. So while a message encrypted by this cipher might look unintelligible, if you study it closely, you'll start to see patterns. If you're encrypting the English language, for example, E is the most common letter used in the English language, say. So when you look at the encrypted text, you might find that the letter L is the most encrypted letter in the text. So then you would suspect that maybe L represents E.
The problem, as some of the greatest code breakers in history have discovered, is finding those patterns in the Voynich manuscript. By the Second World War, the art of encrypting documents had been nearly perfected by the Germans' Enigma cipher machine. To crack the Enigma's code, Allied codebreakers had to push their technology beyond its limits.
The governments brought together teams of hundreds, if not thousands, of their brightest minds to try to figure out how these ciphers, how these substitutions were working. And in order to break the codes, they had to try thousands and thousands and thousands of different combinations, to the point where they couldn't really be done by hand, and they had to invent machines to break the codes for them. And they started with mechanical machines and eventually built up to electronic machines.
Aided by Colossus, the world's first electronic programmable computer, the Allies deciphered what was then the most complex code in history. But then, they tried to break the Voynich manuscript.
So many of these cryptographers from the UK and the United States and elsewhere who'd broken these extremely difficult ciphers from the 20th century tried to break this 15th century cipher. So why is it that they failed?
Even to the world's best minds, the Voynich manuscript seems impenetrable. If it's a code, no one can break it. If it's a language, no one can understand it. Everything seen on its pages is a mystery. Gordon Rugg is a Voynich expert. He believes he might have the answer. He feels the mystery is not what we can see in the manuscript, but what we can't.
Even the most perfectionist modern calligraphers still make some mistakes. They have to erase those mistakes, scratch the parchment clean, and then write the correct text. There's no evidence of that happening in the Voynich manuscript. So the strong implication is that the content didn't matter. The person was just writing gibberish and they knew it.
But the perfection found in the Voynich manuscript could reveal that it's a fake. Professor Gordon Rugg believes he has the answer.
The simplest explanation for the Voynich manuscript is that it's a hoax.
It's a brilliant hoax. It's an amazing hoax.
A hoax that lasts for 500 years.
Hoax? What? You mean all the secrets of the universe are not in this one book? That raises a kind of obvious question. Why would anyone do that? It must have taken years. Doesn't they have anything better to do? So what could it be? Well, let me think. Why do most people do anything? Usually because of this. Could it be that the manuscript was faked to make money? Could the Voynich manuscript be a perfect crime created by a medieval prankster? To investigate, experts would need to go back to the 15th century. Works like those of Nostradamus were hugely successful when they were first published. The educated classes revered any book that promised the secrets of the universe.
there would be a big market for something like this, precisely because it's so strange and rare and because it's so secret. For a Renaissance banker, owning a manuscript was like owning a Van Gogh to a modern-day Wall Street banker. It shows that you're about more than money. You know what culture is, and you're a cultured, intelligent individual. So it's a mark of status. It's a mark of conspicuous consumption.
Even if there was a financial incentive to create the manuscript, how could its author make it appear as technically consistent as real language?
Most people had previously assumed that to create something the size of the Voynich manuscript as meaningless gibberish would take decades. If you try making up gibberish out of your head, it's surprisingly difficult. You start repeating yourself over and over again. That would be easily detectable. There are cases of people doing things like automatic writing, but again, the record doesn't match what we see in the Voynich manuscript. There are things that you can do like randomly combining characters, but we know the combinations are not random. So all of the plausible, familiar ways of generating meaningless gibberish produce output which is visibly different from what you see in the Voynich manuscript.
But Professor Rugg has an incredible new theory. Creating the manuscript was actually easy, and today he's going to put his theory to the test.
I think that what we'll see today is large quantities of text coming out, text which has got similar characteristics to Voynichese in different ways. I think another thing we'll see today is how quickly text can be produced using this method, whether or not it would be feasible to use this method to produce a meaningless hoax for profit.
Gordon hopes his experiment will reveal how the author created an indecipherable manuscript quickly and easily. To begin, Gordon is using 3 world-class calligraphers. Working on a table consisting of 600 blank squares, the calligraphers copy random syllables from the Voynich manuscript into the squares, leaving some of them blank. 3 squares are then cut in random positions from heavy cardboard called a grill. The grill is then placed anywhere on the table. This simple technique reveals a Voynichese word. Finally, the word is copied onto a page of manuscript. The grill slides to the right and it's repeated. Using this method, the entire Voynich manuscript could be created in weeks.
These people have produced text that looks like Voynichese. They've produced it fast. At this speed, you'd be able to produce the entire manuscript in a matter of weeks with a team like this. So I think this shows that my method's certainly feasible.
The experiment suggests that the author could have created the Voynich manuscript quickly and out of greed. But until the truth is revealed, for many, the mystery remains. If this remarkable book does contain dark and mysterious secrets, we'll need to discover new ways of finding them. Weird or what? I get it. I can read this. You saw Takema as etc. Go to now recovery in
It's so close to what we know, and yet it's so far from what we can decipher. So something that lies just outside our grasp. We need to find out what's in there because it is so intriguing.
So there we have it. 3 strange and mysterious stories, but each with many plausible theories to explain them. How did traces of cocaine end up on Egyptian mummies up to 3,000 years old? A 19th century scam? Or must history be rewritten? Did the ancient Egyptians travel to South America? Did thousands of sea lions suddenly leave San Francisco simply because they were following their source of food? Or do they have the power to sense earthquakes? And is the Voynich manuscript a meaningless hoax? Is it written in a forgotten tongue? Or does this medieval tome contain dark, coded secrets? You decide. Join me next time for more stories that will undoubtedly be weird or what? You know, I've been around for a while. Met some interesting people. Done some crazy things. So you just might think that there's not much that can take me by surprise. You'd be wrong. The world is full of stories, science and things that amaze and confound me. Every single day, incredible mysteries that keep me awake at night. Some I can answer. Others just defy logic. Do parallel worlds exist? In New York, a woman has a frightening encounter with a mysterious shadow shaped like a human. Was it an entity from another dimension?
There was something very sinister about it.
In New Jersey, a boy becomes entangled in a strange machine.
On the count of 3, we jump through the field of energy.
And ends up in another world. Does teleportation exist? And in Mexico, an explorer uncovers a bizarre skull made of crystal. Is it a doorway to another universe? Yeah. It's a weird world, and I love it. Bubbles! Beautiful, aren't they? Well, guess what? Scientists believe that we're living in one. They say that our entire universe is a giant, perhaps infinite-sized, one of these. But if that's hard to comprehend, there's something else. In 2010, scientists found something extraordinary. Evidence that our bubble, our universe, has been bruised not once but 4 times. Why? Because it smashed into other bubbles. And do you know what those other bubbles are? Other universes. There could be millions of them. Parallel worlds. Other dimensions that exist alongside ours. Amazing, isn't it? But let's think about this. If it's true, that means there could be people or something like us floating around inside them. Isn't that a little scary? Could we, in the distant future, bump into something or someone from a neighboring dimension? Well, I've got news for you. It's happening right now. Bubbles! Rosemary Gilley is an author. In October 2010, she decided to go hiking in the Fahnestock State Park in New York.
So I trekked out by myself, which is not always a good idea. And there was no one around. There was no one on the trail. And I went out to what we call the King's Chamber.
The King's Chamber is one of several mysterious man-made structures in the area.
Nobody really knows who built them or why. And many people who visit them have paranormal experiences.
Some think Native Americans made them. Others believe it was European settlers or even ancient Druids. No one knows for sure, but as Rosemary enters the ruins, she begins to sense something strange.
I could sense an unusual presence there. You have a feeling that there may be something unseen watching you, or that something unusual is about to happen.
Despite her misgivings, Rosemary presses on. It's not long before she's sorry she did.
I became aware of a dark shape moving through the trees in front of me. There was something very sinister about it. This figure was tall and slim, and it looked like the outline of a human being. It was very dark in color, inky dark, and it had very blurry edges, and the lower portion of it sort of trailed away. There's no facial features, no eyes, but yet you know it's looking at you. You can just feel it. And that is a very scary thing.
Was Rosemary's mind playing tricks? Or was someone or something stalking her through the King's Chamber?
And this was not an apparition. You simply know when you are encountering something that's not quite of this world.
So what was it? Rosemary didn't wait around to find out.
It was like one of those movies where bad things are happening to people and a voice says, "Get out, it's time to go."
What did Rosemary Gillies see? Was she in real danger from a shadow, or was it something even more sinister? Incredibly, her experience is not unique. Hundreds have reported encounters with dark, humanoid, transparent creatures. They call them shadow people. But what are they? Rosemary has come to an incredible conclusion.
Shadow people come from other dimensions, parallel dimensions that are right here on this planet. They're just around a certain bend in space where we can't normally see them except under the right circumstances.
Are shadow people intruders from a parallel dimension? If so, how do they cross into our world? And what do they want? Chris French is a psychologist. He believes there is a simple explanation.
These shadow people are just shadows. The way that these shadow people are said to move is kind of a very fleeting motion. One moment they're there, next moment they're somewhere else. I mean, to me, it sounds very much like the way that shadows move.
Are shadow people simply random shadows? If so, what gives them such distinct human shapes? French believes the answer lies in a phenomenon called pareidolia.
Pareidolia refers specifically to this idea that we can sometimes think we see clear and distinct human forms in what is essentially just random background noise. I think everybody's probably had the experience of looking at patterns on wallpaper and making out faces in those patterns. Or we look up into the clouds and we see animal shapes. People have found images of Christ in plates of spaghetti, in cinnamon buns, in the burn marks on tortillas. What you've got are really kind of more or less random patterns, but we will impose some kind of meaning on them. People tend to experience shadow people in certain kinds of locations. If you're in a forest, if you're in a cave, if you're in somewhere where there's lots of shadows, then those are precisely the kind of random background visual noise situations where you might actually think you can see things that aren't there. And there's probably also the fact that in certain kinds of environments there are reasons why we might actually feel on edge. So for example, if you went into a cave and there's a very, very high ceiling in the cave, then again that will tend to make us feel slightly on edge because we don't know what's up there, what might be about to jump on us. And if you think of this from the evolutionary perspective, it makes sense that in certain locations we are more kind of alert, more on guard, more aware of possible threats in the environment than in other places.
But many who have encountered shadow people feel physically threatened. Why?
I think one of the reasons that people often perceive these things as being something potentially threatening is because that's the way we've evolved. In terms of our evolutionary history, then it makes sense that we have cognitive systems that are very much tuned to picking up on possible threats in the environment. And so very often, if we think we can see some kind of form, if we think there's something out there that might do us harm, then it's better to err on the side of perceiving it that way as a potential threat and getting out of any possible danger rather than to take any risks. Some guy back in the Stone Age and he thinks that there might be a saber-toothed tiger in that bush. On the one hand, you've got the guy who very quickly decides it's a saber-toothed tiger and runs away. You've got the other guy who stands there scratching his beard wondering whether it really is a saber-toothed tiger. He gets eaten. So who's going to pass on their genes? We've evolved to survive.
Are our survival instincts tricking us into believing a shadow is a terrifying and real creature?
It's an extremely common phenomenon for perfectly sane people to sometimes see things that aren't actually there. There are parts of the brain that are hardwired to recognize faces and human forms. And so sometimes those parts of the brain will actually fire when what we're looking at are really just shadows.
Are shadow people simply shadows? Rosemary Gilly isn't convinced.
It was not a trick of my imagination. It was unmistakable, a black shape moving through the trees.
You know, it's amazing how real shadows can appear. But could something like this be a terrifying shadow creature from another dimension that's come to pay us a visit? Did you do that, Fluffy? So who exactly are shadow people? Where do they come from? One man believes he has the answer.
They belong to a race of beings that predates human beings. They exist in a dimension very close to ours.
A woman has a terrifying encounter with a human-like shadow. Was it a trick of her mind or a visitor from a parallel world? Philip Imbrogno is a paranormal researcher. He thinks the answer is clear.
From the cases that I've studied about shadow people, I believe they are interdimensional in nature. They're intelligent. They belong to a race of beings that predates human beings. They exist in a dimension very close to ours.
It's an incredible theory, but it begs one big question. How can we know these other dimensions exist? Imbrogno believes the answer lies with the force of gravity and its component part, the graviton.
A graviton is a theoretical particle that ties the entire universe together. It blends in with Einstein's theory of special relativity. And one of the things that science could not explain for many centuries is why is gravity the weakest force in the universe? Theoretically, it should be the strongest force. It's not. Now, the particle that is responsible for gravity has been labeled the graviton. Gravitons flow through the dimensions just like a wave. These particles have a pull, like a magnetic pull. The gravity coming from our sun, reaching the Earth, should theoretically tear the Earth apart, but it doesn't. If all of these gravitons being emitted from the sun were filtered through multi-dimensions before they reach us, it could give us an indication that these other extra dimensions do in fact exist.
If that sounds like gobbledygook, here's the simple version. Imbrogno thinks gravity is being weakened as it travels from the sun to Earth because it's being diffused as it passes through, yeah, you guessed it, other dimensions that are home to shadow people. It's an extraordinary and somewhat crazy idea, but if there are other dimensions surrounding ours, how are shadow people traveling between them and to us?
Shadow people may understand the concept of gravitons more than we do. Their technology has been around thousands and thousands of years before human beings. So they may understand that they may have to focus gravitons at a particular area to open up a portal to lead into our reality.
According to Imbrogno, he will soon have hard scientific evidence to support his theory.
When these dimensions are opened up, we should see an influx of gravitons. This interaction can be measured. So the exciting research that I'm involved in right now is building devices that would be able to detect large amounts of gravitons to predict when shadow people would appear.
Are shadow people using gravity to open portals to our dimension? And if so, what do they want?
Their purpose, their agenda may vary depending upon the group of shadow people. I don't think they have one agenda. I don't think they work together as a team. I think they work together more or less in clans or groups. Some of them have certain agendas. Some of them may have different agendas. It seems to me that the main objective of the shadow person's visit is to learn about us as much as they can by observing us. Some people would find that very unsettling. Usually, the prelude to an invasion is going and getting intelligence before you make your move. Some people believe this is what's being done. I would like to think that they just discovered us and they're as curious about us as we are about them. And perhaps someday in the future they may make their presence known to us and try to coexist with us, since we are neighbors. They are the neighbors we really, very rarely see. The next door neighbor who has a big high fence in which we can't see what they're like. We're trying to find out about them, but we can't violate their privacy. And one day, maybe the neighbor will open up the gate and announce themselves and say, we've been, listening for you for many, many years and we'd like to be friends.
Did Rosemary Gilly encounter a curious shadow person? Are we facing an invasion of beings from a neighboring dimension? Should we be afraid, very afraid? Or are they nothing but a trick of light? Weird. Or what? I used to get into a lot of sticky situations during our voyage on the Starship Enterprise, but I was always able to get out of them like this. See what I just did there? And I didn't even have Scotty to beam me up. But can we somehow transport ourselves from one location to another in an instant? Things like that are science fiction. Right? Wrong. 1960, suburban New Jersey. 6-year-old Andrew Bashiaka was about to have the most incredible day of his life.
My dad called out to my mother and said, "Hon, I'm taking Andy to the hardware store." Instead, he drove me up to the old aeronautical company facility in Woodridge, New Jersey, a large defense technical experimental area that dated back to World War II.
As they enter the facility, Andrew wonders why his father Frank would bring him to a place like this.
I didn't know what was happening.
Andrew's dad leads him to a secret room. Inside is something unlike anything he's ever seen before.
It was so strange. It essentially consisted of 2 elliptical-shaped booms that were about 8 feet tall and about 10 feet across.
It's a machine that's beyond Andrew's comprehension. Whatever it is, his father is clearly in charge. But why? And what is it for?
Had the technician turn the device on.
As Andrew watches, the booms begin to spin, generating a strange cascade of energy.
That looked almost like water falling in a public fountain. It was a very beautiful, sort of shimmering field of energy.
As the energy field from the machine grows, Andrew's dad does something incredible. He tells his son to take his hand, then the unimaginable happens.
We counted down, 1, 2, 3. On the count of 3, we jumped through the field of energy. We seemed to be moving, and I could ultimately see a point of light in the distance. And that light reached us very quickly and accelerated. And when the light hit us, we were elsewhere in the country. Now, my father didn't tell me where we were going. In fact, we were jumping 2,005 miles through this vortal tunnel in the fabric of time-space to the state capitol grounds in Santa Fe, New Mexico.
It's an astonishing claim. Did two humans actually transport from New Jersey to New Mexico in the blink of an eye? What happened to Andrew and his father? Is his story just the wild fantasy of a 6-year-old? Basciago believes there is only one answer.
I think I must have teleported. Imagine traveling through the Lincoln Tunnel in New York City at 10,000 miles per hour without any automobile around you. That's sort of what it was like. We were physically moving through a vortal tunnel in the fabric of time-space.
Had Andrew's father, Frank, invented the world's first teleportation machine? And if so, why? Frank Basciago was no ordinary dad. During the Cold War, the US and Soviets raced for military superiority. Frank was head of a top-secret American research team who were conducting experiments into teleportation. But why did Frank use his son as a guinea pig?
I think my dad's immediate goal in inviting me to teleport was to show that if teleportation was safe for his son, it was safe for anybody's child. And I was in it as a child, just as, for example, a child may have been aboard, one of Columbus's boats, or may have been an office boy to the Wright brothers, or an assistant to Thomas Alva Edison.
After the success of his experiment, Frank Basciago decides teleportation is too important to keep secret. He wants to tell the world, but the US military disagrees.
And so the unfortunate history of US teleportation is that it has remained essentially a military secret ever since.
40 years later, Andrew is on a mission. He believes teleportation technology is vitally important. His father's invention should be available to all of us.
Today, I'm leading the Truth Campaign. I'm urging the United States government to declassify teleportation, to allow people to teleport between major world cities. The way I see it, I have a duty simply to stand in my truth and tell the truth about what happened, because this was clearly an important epoch in the history of applied science. This was the moment when our human civilization on Earth became a time-space faring civilization. And so I'm speaking out primarily because I feel I have an historical duty to inform humanity that time-space emerged in this context in the late 60s and early 1970s, and that in the 21st century, we may need to use teleportation to solve the crisis of environment and development. And so I'm speaking out also simply with the hope that if we can declassify and deploy teleportation, we can use it to actively advantage humanity in the 21st century.
Did Frank Basciago invent a machine that could instantly transport us across the world, or even to other dimensions? Is teleportation possible?
I wouldn't like to be the first one to be teleported. I would worry to end up maybe like a Picasso painting.
A boy enters a teleportation machine and is suddenly transported thousands of miles in seconds. Is human teleportation possible? Raymond Laflamme is a physicist. He thinks the idea we can teleport our bodies is simply fantasy.
It seems that the laws of physics are more constrained than the imagination of human beings. The first idea that we have when we think about teleportation is the Star Trek idea. Beam me up, Scotty. The idea of taking a person, suddenly disintegrate in some form and reappearing up in a space station. Now, this is something that happens in science fiction.
But incredibly, although Laflamme dismisses the idea that people can teleport, he does believe it can happen in other ways, because he was one of the first scientists to do it.
We're not teleporting matter from one location to the other. We're really teleporting information.
Wait a second. Teleporting information? How is that any different than sending an email?
When we send an email, or even when we talk on our cell phone, the information goes from the sender through the intervening space to a receiver.
Remarkably, Laflamme has been able to teleport information without it traveling through any device at all.
What has been teleported is one quantum bit of information, or qubit, is sent from one location to the other. It has happened in nuclear magnetic resonance, where the information has gone from one atom of a molecule to another one. But it has also appeared in optics, where people have put information or quantum information in a particle of light called photons, send it to another location a few kilometers away, and then made it reappear over there. We've been able to teleport a few kilometers, taking one particle of information and make it reappear a few kilometers down the line. We've been able to do this.
It works like this. In the world of quantum physics, even the tiniest particles are somehow connected, even across huge distances. In quantum teleportation, such entangled particles can literally be in two places at once.
Absolutely amazing that we can teleport. In quantum teleportation, it seems to disappear here and reappear there. It looks like a piece of magic, a piece which we're not used to. Once we have technology based on quantum entanglement, on quantum teleportation, maybe we'll think it's very familiar and banal, but today for us, it looks something very unusual.
This technology could soon be used to instantly communicate with spaceships, no matter how far away. Or send military communications that are impossible to intercept.
We're just at the beginning of understanding what is quantum teleportation, how it works.
We may be able to teleport information, but does Andrew Basiago's story mean we can do it to ourselves? Laflamme thinks not.
You must have a secret that I do not have to be able to do this. But I wouldn't like to be the first one to be teleported. I would worry to end up maybe like a Picasso painting.
If human teleportation isn't possible, what happened to Andrew Basiago? Was his incredible journey just a figment of childhood imagination? Bruce Goldberg is a hypnotherapist. He thinks stories like Andrew's are very real.
We have ancient literature going back thousands of years of people who've teleported. There are a lot of religious cases, but there are also secular cases too. I think teleportation exists.
But how? Goldberg believes he's discovered the secret.
Teleportation is a very complex mechanism, and basically what happens is it's very similar in the beginning to out-of-body experiences where you might feel like a buzzing sound or a tingly feeling. Very often people feel a pop over the left ear, a popping sound, okay? And then they're going to feel a rush and a feeling of spiraling upwards. Now remember, from their perspective, they don't notice any difference. They feel these feelings, but people, to observe them objectively, would see them actually disappearing. Just they're there 1 second and they're not there the next. So they have this spiraling upward feeling. Their perspective when they're going through the teleportation is very narrowed. It's almost like you're looking through a keyhole. Their perspective gets very, very strange for a few moments, and then they arrive at the location where they designed to be. This tingling feeling, the buzzing, the spiraling upward sensation of a rush, of an energy rush, are characteristics of both teleportation and out-of-body experience. The difference here is the keyhole effect is limited to the teleportation, and of course the physical body moves from one location to another. I first discovered teleportation while working with patients. People would describe disappearing from one location. One gentleman went from New York City to Paris in an instant. I mean, he disappeared. His wife was sitting in the same room and telling me, yeah, my husband disappeared. I don't know where he went, and I was right there.
At first, Goldberg doubted his patients.
So then I started doing research about the teleportation cases. These are psychologically stable people. I know them, I know the families, and they weren't on drugs, okay?
But as he continued his research, Goldberg's patients began to describe their teleportation experiences in remarkable detail. And they all had one thing in common.
You see first just a little bit like tunnel vision, and then all of a sudden you appear whole. The people look exactly like we do. Some of the people that I meet are recognizable. I know who they are.
Incredibly, the people they encountered were replicas of themselves. The hauntingly similar experiences led Goldberg to a stunning insight.
When you teleport, you leave this universe and move into a parallel universe. Parallel universes are sister universes that exist alongside ours. Your DNA is exactly the same in your parallel life as it is here.
Are Goldberg's patients somehow being sucked into parallel dimensions and then meeting their own doppelgangers?
Now this is getting really crazy. Is there more than one Bill? Is there more than one you? Sounds nuts, right? Incredibly, physicists believe that these identical copies of ourselves might exist. Now, I don't really understand how this is possible, but if the eggheads say the math works, who am I to argue?
Do identical copies of each and every one of us exist in parallel worlds? Could we even enter those alternate realities? Bruce Goldberg believes the possibilities are staggering.
Let's say you have certain aspects of your life right now that you cannot change. Maybe you have an incurable disease. Maybe you have a criminal record. Maybe you've lost an arm. Well, in a parallel universe, that didn't exist. So instead of committing suicide or just going through life being depressed, you can actually switch universes and, in fact, have a much better life.
But if it really is possible to leap into a parallel world, why isn't everyone doing it?
Teleportation is hardly predictable. You can do this 1,000 times and you may get 1 or 2 examples. But future technology will be such that teleportation will be established by machines so people can control it and do it with regularity and predictability.
Could such technology already exist? Could Frank Basciaco's dream still be alive?
I don't doubt there is some technology that can exist today where somebody can enter into this like a vortex and they can be teleported from one place to another.
Do we all exist in other dimensions? Do we possess machines that can teleport us from one world to another? Could Scotty really beam us up after all? Weird or what? In Mexico, an explorer finds a strange skull made of pure crystal. Is it a gateway to another world?
Crystal skulls are holographic.
You know, I love exploring. Nothing better than getting out and seeing what you can find amongst the wilds of nature. Oh, you hear that? You hear that? Sometimes you can find treasures beyond the imagination. But sometimes you find things you want to keep very secret.
In 1924, British adventurer Frederick Mitchell Hedges went in search of Mayan treasures in the tiny country of Belize in Central America. What he discovered is regarded by some as the most important archaeological relic ever found. A perfectly formed human skull made from crystal. Carved with flawless precision, this 2,000-year-old artifact baffled scientists. Many believe the technology that created it couldn't have existed in ancient or even modern times. So what was it? And where did it come from? Remarkably, the answer could lie in an ancient Mayan legend that speaks of not one, but 13 crystal skulls that have extraordinary powers. It's a legend that could be based in fact. In 1994, amateur archaeologist Nick Nocerino found another perfect life-size skull, impeccably carved in clear crystal in Guerrero, Mexico. Kirby Seed is a crystal and mineral expert. In 1995, the Guerrero skull came into his care. As he began to study it, something weird happened.
And it began to show me pictures of past lives. It showed me images of possible futures that I could try to achieve for. And those pictures turn into visions. Those visions, I see people moving, I see objects moving, there's motion in those visions. And suddenly I feel like I've popped into that particular reality. And I feel like I'm merging my energy with its energy.
But Kirby believes this skull has many other powers. The greatest of all is the ability to open doors to another world.
Crystal skulls are holographic. They contain all the points of time and space. We know in modern physics theory, in string theory, that there are at least 11 dimensions. Skulls are portals to other dimensions and parallel worlds.
Do crystal skulls possess strange powers that can take us to other dimensions? Or is there another answer to this mystery?
Well, to my mind, there's not really a mystery surrounding them.
A man believes an ancient crystal skull can communicate with parallel worlds. Do these strange, mysterious objects have powers beyond our comprehension?
Well, to my mind, there's not really a mystery surrounding them.
Jane Walsh is an anthropologist at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. She believes crystal skulls aren't quite as magical as they seem.
I've essentially concluded that none of the skulls I have looked at have really anything to do with pre-Columbian Mexico. Mostly they were marketed to deceive.
Jane has examined 9 crystal skulls, including the one discovered by Mitchell Hedges. Due to the nature of the crystal, it's not possible to determine when the skulls were made. But Jane believes there's another way to unearth the skull's secrets. Using liquid silicone, she can find out how they were made.
The silicone sort of flows in nicely to all of the crevices. Make sure it's going into all of the carved areas.
Once the silicone is dry, Jane has a highly accurate mold of the markings on the skull surface. Using an electron microscope, these can be magnified over 10 million times.
As those electrons strike the surface of the sample, we're going to generate a signal. We'll get a topographical image of the surface of the sample. And we get great spatial resolution. We see very good detail. We can see a lot of things that we wouldn't be able to see otherwise.
One thing in particular was remarkable. Evidence that the perfect crystal skulls weren't quite as perfect as they seemed.
What you're seeing there is the edge of a rotary disc cutting tool.
If you imagine some guy sitting here doing this, trying to drill this little hole, we're not going to have this little path that cuts. You can follow it all the way around.
Jane's analysis is damning. She believes whoever made the skulls had access to modern power tools.
We know the sorts of tools that were used by pre-Columbian lapidaries, which was essentially a Stone Age toolkit. They probably used copper with abrasive sand, perhaps in drilling and cutting, but essentially they used stone to carve stone. So looking at some of the skulls, it's very apparent that hard metal with permanently adhered diamond abrasives were used to cut them. So with the Mitchell Hedges skull, we were able to find some of the initial carving that was done by very tiny, high-speed dentist-type drills. That's simply not a tool that any Mayan or Aztec would have had.
So, if the skulls are not ancient Mayan or Aztec, when were they carved?
They probably are about as old as when they first appeared. It's certainly true of this skull. We know it was purchased in 1960 in Mexico, and it was polished and carved with an abrasive that wasn't available until after World War II. So probably it was made in the 1950s. The British Museum skull was probably made not too long before it first appeared on the art market, which was the early 1880s. All of them were created by using quite modern tools.
Are the crystal skulls simply an elaborate hoax? Does the harsh light of Jane's microscope mean we should dismiss those who believe they have mystical powers?
I would love it if someone would excavate one, a recognized archaeologist, but I'm not holding my breath.
Is the legend of 13 all-powerful crystal skulls nothing more than fanciful bunkum? Or do they have powers beyond comprehension? Could Kirby Seed be right? Are they gateways to other dimensions? Joshua Shapiro is an explorer. He not only believes crystal skulls can connect us to other worlds, but they were given to us by beings who live in them.
What I believe is the connection between the crystal skulls and, let's say, other intelligences which may come from parallel worlds or other dimensions. These beings, I believe, brought the crystal skulls in physical form to humanity a very long time ago. They brought them as tools to help us to grow and to understand who we really are, which I believe is divine souls. I believe all of us are divine beings. But when we incarnate as a human being, we forget the essence of who we are. So these parallel worlds are trying to help us to remember this, and what they will do occasionally at different points in history, and again, this is my theory, and I think there are other people involved in the crystal skulls who believe this, is that they bring tools that act as a catalyst to awaken us.
Did crystal skulls arrive from parallel worlds in ancient times? And if so, how do these other dimensional beings use them as doorways to connect with humans? Shapiro thinks it all comes down to what they're made of.
The crystal skulls act as portals or dimensional doors because quartz crystal has the ability to exist in many different dimensions simultaneously. It's the property of the material itself. It just lends itself to working with energy on different vibrational frequencies. So that's why it's a perfect conduit.
Quartz crystal vibrating frequencies across multiple dimensions. Crazy talk, right? Well, in fact, crystals have been used in communication devices like radios for nearly a century. They can be tuned to vibrate at specific frequencies, which allows them to tune in broadcasts. So maybe a crystal skull could be an interdimensional telephone after all.
Quartz crystal is one of the most important materials on the planet, but to put it into the shape of a human bone skull, those two combined make them very special. So these other intelligences can use the crystal skull to communicate with us.
So are crystal skulls portals for messages from other dimensions? If so, what are they trying to convey?
If I could define in one sentence what the crystal skulls are, they are a mirror and a catalyst to awaken humanity. If we as individuals would just be open to all the amazing phenomena that's going on in our world instead of trying to rationalize it, I think that our planet would be at peace much quicker, and we would learn a lot more about ourselves, and we would have additional assistance coming that we could not even imagine.
Do crystal skulls have the ability to create electrical signals that allow us to interact with other dimensions? Or are they simply harmless hunks of polished rock? Is there any scientific evidence that gateways to other worlds even exist at all?
What an incredible story. Can this skull generate vibrations that allow us to speak to people in parallel worlds? Can you imagine what we could achieve if we could harness the power within this magnificent, priceless object? Oh! Can we get another one?
A mysterious crystal skull discovered in Mexico is believed to be a doorway to another dimension. Could this be possible? Dr. Paul Stevenson studies extreme physics at the University of Surrey. He thinks the idea of a portal to a distant world is quite plausible.
One possible way we could at least theoretically think about opening a door to another world or a portal to somewhere else comes from black holes.
Astronomers once believed that everything in a black hole was crushed into a single point of infinite mass called a singularity. But recently, some have proposed another idea.
It's conceivable that you'd make some kind of portal from one part of the universe to another that you could actually travel through, and that would be called a wormhole. According to Einstein's theory of relativity, heavy objects will tend to warp space. And you can kind of think of that as if space was some kind of stretched rubber sheet, and you put a very heavy thing on, it's going to make a depression in the sheet. And that's something like our sun would make a depression in this rubber sheet. And you imagine sort of rolling a ball along, it will sort of have to bend around the sun because of the way the sheet's been depressed. And that's kind of what happens, say, when a comet sort of slingshots around the sun. Now, in the case of a black hole, I have a kind of model here to show the sort of depression you might get in space with something like a black hole or a star would be in this depression here. The special thing about a black hole is that this depression goes on and on forever. And if something gets caught in it, it'll just go down and be lost. Now, what happens with a wormhole is you would end up having two black holes connected together, something like that. So you can sort of imagine that if you fell in one end of the black hole, you could come out the other end. And so theoretically, this thing could exist. We haven't ever seen one, but there's no reason, based on our understanding of physics, why something like this couldn't happen.
And if we can create a sort of tunnel to other parts of our universe, what does that mean for parallel dimensions?
Now, it may not be a big leap to suggest that we could create a wormhole that connects us to different dimensions or a different universe.
According to Paul, in theory, it's possible to create a pathway to other worlds. It's nothing anyone's ever seen before. So how does he know it could happen?
But they're actually based on solid physics and solid science. And we've certainly come across lots of things in the past that at first sight seem to be utterly ridiculous or completely fantastical and have turned out to be true. I don't know whether that's going to turn out to be the case for wormholes, whether we'll ever see one, but it's certainly not beyond the bounds of reason.
Could we open cosmic gateways into parallel worlds and communicate with them with crystal skulls? Or can we simply teleport our bodies there whenever we wish? Are shadow people from other dimensions already amongst us? Weird. What? So there we have it. Stories of parallel worlds from all over the planet. In New York, a woman has a terrifying encounter with a human-shaped shadow. Did it come from another dimension? In New Jersey, a weird machine transports a boy and his father hundreds of miles in a split second. Did they teleport to a different world? And in Mexico, a team makes an amazing discovery. A skull made of crystal. Is it a doorway to a parallel universe? Are Are these stories evidence that parallel worlds exist? Can we dismiss the claims of those who believe they are true? You decide.
Join me again next time for more stories that will undoubtedly be weird or what? You know, I've been around for a while. Met some interesting people. Done some crazy things. So you just might think that there's not much that can take me by surprise. You'd be wrong. The world is full of stories, science and things that amaze and confound me. Every single day, incredible mysteries that keep me awake at night. Some I can answer. Others just defy logic.
Is the end of the world upon us? In Wyoming, a deadly force is sleeping underneath Yellowstone National Park. Could it awake and destroy the planet?
It could happen today. It could happen tomorrow. It's a race against time.
In Alabama, a NASA scientist makes a remarkable discovery. Is a killer solar storm coming our way?
If it were hit today, would knock us out, would knock civilization to its knees.
And across the world comes the threat of an invasion by robots. Could the Terminator be real?
Yeah. It's a weird world, and I love it. Do you believe in prophecies? Some of the biggest events in history have been foreseen by some of the greatest minds. Nostradamus predicted World War I, Hitler, Napoleon, the election of U.S. President Barack Obama, and the atomic destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. How did he do that? And why can't I do that? Were they simply lucky guesses? Can we somehow see with incredible accuracy what will happen hundreds or perhaps thousands of years into the future? And if we can, do we really want to know what's coming?
Patrick Gerald is an astronomer. In 1996, he did something extraordinary. He devoted his life to studying the complex and mysterious texts of the ancient Mayans. What he found is now the stuff of Hollywood. The world is coming to an end, and soon.
What captivated me the most after reading the Mayan prophecies was that they calculated this huge cataclysm at the end of 2012. And this was very disturbing information for me. I said, wow, gee, my whole future and the whole future of everybody will be destroyed in a few years. What am I going to do? And that changed my whole life. Before 1996, I planned to become the oldest person in the world by following a long living diet. In the morning, 1.5 liter orange juice, in the midday, 7 steamed bananas, and in the evening, rice with 1 kilo vegetables and 2 egg yolks.
But knowing when the world would end wasn't enough. Patrick had to know how it would happen. For the next 2 years, using complex mathematical formulas, he set out to decode the Mayans' hidden messages.
I was immediately grasped by the fact that they had very high accuracy and that they were able to calculate something very spectacular into the future. And it took me several years to decode it, but I found what will happen in 2012.
What did Patrick find? Is it an asteroid? Nuclear war? How will the world end? Gerald believes on December 12th, 2012, a sleeping giant will awake.
The supervolcano will erupt, and that will destroy completely our civilization.
There are at least 7 known supervolcanoes on Earth. They contain massive amounts of molten rock, which is trapped inside them below the Earth's crust. The pressure builds until finally it bursts, exploding in a catastrophic eruption thousands of times more powerful than a regular volcano. The last eruption occurred over 70,000 years ago. Could one of these giants be a threat to us now? Remarkably, the answer could be yes. And it's underneath Yellowstone National Park. Over 2 million tourists visit Yellowstone every year. Little do they know that under the surface lies one of the deadliest forces on the planet. Incredibly, this sleeping supervolcano may be coming to life. In 2004, scientists detected the ground starting to bulge around Yellowstone. Soon after, over 1,000 mini-earthquakes occurred there in just a few months. Some dismiss it, but others say it can only mean one thing.
The scientists that are saying that, well, the rumbling at Yellowstone Park, that is normal, well, they don't know what the Maya knew. The rotation from the Earth will change. Once the inner core of the Earth starts moving on its head, then the lava that is around the inner core will be pushed also very sharply to the crust, and we will have an eruption of the Yellowstone at the end of 2012.
Did Patrick Gerald unlock the Mayan secret? Is the Yellowstone supervolcano about to erupt? And could it mean the end of the world? Robert Vicino is an entrepreneur and survivalist. He's not waiting to find out.
If you thought Mount St. Helens was something to see, wait till you see Yellowstone go.
In 2003, Robert decided that there was only one way to survive the blast of a supervolcano: by building volcano-proof bunkers all over America.
It's a race against time to get our shelters built. You could say it isn't so and ignore the possibilities, but it's not going to make it go away.
Made of concrete and steel, these self-contained bunkers are buried underground. They can house up to 1,000 people and store enough food for a year. But who is going to use them?
We have about 10,000 members currently signed up from all over the world. After the Japan quake, we had a spike. I think we received 600-700 people in one day. So the awareness is going up. You know, as my prediction is, if we're still here a year from now, in early 2012, we're going to have a line. People are going to be waiting in line, begging to get in, and it'll be too late. When I first mentioned it to people, they thought it was crazy. I found that the reactions have changed in the last year, and even more specifically, this year, 2011. Now they're really wanting to know, where is it, and how big are they, and how do we get in, and how much does it cost? Because I think people are starting to realize it's coming. And it may be coming sooner than we think. You know, something interesting, and I just heard this today. Somebody advised me that, you know, the Mayan calendar talks about or we believe it ends on December 21st, 2012. And a lot of people say, well, so what, it ends, it's going to restart. And there's no proof of anything, and that's not what they meant, that the world was going to end. What I heard this morning was, 15 years ago, the common interpretation of the calendar was that it would end on December 24th, 2011. So it's closer than we think.
Could Vicino and his friends someday be the only surviving members of the human race?
If Yellowstone blows, you're looking at a life extinction event. The only parties that are going to survive are those that are underground. It could happen today, it could happen tomorrow. I think the Mayans knew something. How they knew, I don't know. Were they informed by some other culture? Did they know? Were they able to see into the future? Were they able to calculate the patterns of the solar system in the heavens to know when the alignments are going to happen, and when this happens, that'll happen? Did they exist in the last go around 3,600 years ago? Or did somebody tell them?
Does this survivalist know something we don't? Whatever the truth is, he's taking no chances.
I don't know what inspired Noah, but I would imagine he was as passionate about what he was doing as I am.
Are Robert Vicino and Patrick Gerald simply prophets of doom? Or could they be right? Will a supervolcano cause the end of the world?
Crazy, isn't it? I mean, if you listen to every doomsday prediction, prophecy, or conspiracy theory, you'd never leave the house, right? I mean, what is it with these people? Do they think that just because they say a giant volcano is going to rip through this planet and wipe us out, that we're going to believe them? I don't believe a word they say. I'm just being careful.
A man decoding the texts of the ancient Mayans uncovers an astonishing prophecy. Will a supervolcano at Yellowstone destroy our planet? Stanley Ambrose is an anthropologist. He thinks we have reason to believe it might.
I suppose if you really wanted to stay around in a place that was struck by an apocalypse, that would be a good idea. I'd rather move.
A lifetime spent studying supervolcanoes has convinced Ambrose they are a force to be feared.
If Yellowstone blows, it would eject a huge amount of dust and gases up to 50 kilometers into the stratosphere. We have to fear global famine. We can imagine complete loss of crop production for decades to centuries.
In 1980, Mount St. Helens erupted in Washington state, sending volcanic ash over 10 kilometers into the air. Ambrose thinks this massive eruption would be dwarfed by Yellowstone. Could humans survive this kind of catastrophic explosion? We may know the answer because it's already happened.
The volcanic eruption of Toba stands among the most explosive and largest in Earth history.
Around 70,000 years ago, a supervolcano exploded at Toba in Indonesia. It was so powerful, it left a crater 100 kilometers long, still visible today.
Volcanic ash rained down over an area larger than the size of the United States. That's big. The Earth was surrounded by this thick blanket of sulfuric acid haze. The sun weakened. Much solar energy was reflected back into outer space. The landscape around the world was basically devegetated. If you lived anywhere from Southeast Asia across to India and Pakistan, the land would have been covered with a very, very fine white dust. That's the volcanic ash. And it is really fine and it is really white. And like snow, it reflects sunlight off of the land surface. Unlike snow, it didn't melt. It had to be washed away by the rains whenever the rains occurred, and that doesn't seem to have been very often. It's a global shock to the world system, what I call an instant ice age.
Before the eruption at Toba, the Earth was home to a healthy population of humans. Ambrose believes we can judge our fate by looking at what happened to them.
The volcanic eruption caused a population crash unlike any that had been seen previously in human history. And during the next 10,000 years, there were very few archaeological traces of humans.
Did a supervolcano take us to the brink of extinction? Could Yellowstone do the same now?
Everything within the blast zone would be buried. There would probably be general infrastructure failure. Agricultural production would, of course, be hammered. The United States would lose its entire grain belt. And if the whole world got cold the way it did with Toba, then there would be few choices of where to go to get food.
It's an alarming scenario. Should we heed the warning? Is the Yellowstone supervolcano ready to blow?
Sometimes it's bulging up like it's going to explode. Then these bulges go back down. One of these bulges coming up is not going to go back down. The pressure just might continue increasing. And that's when it's time to head for the hills.
Could Stanley Ambrose be right? Are billions of people in imminent danger of death by supervolcano? Jake Lowenster is the chief scientist at the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory.
It's my job to worry about whether Yellowstone's going to erupt.
Jake studied the supervolcano's behavior. He believes it's not a monster, but a pussycat.
People talk about impending doom because they know there have been eruptions in Yellowstone's past. There have been very, very large eruptions at Yellowstone, the size of eruptions that people will call super eruptions. One of the things that you'll hear about when people talk about Yellowstone is somehow that it's overdue. And they throw out this number of 600,000 years for an interval between these large eruptions. Well, that number is pretty much taken out of nowhere. If you did the math on those three big eruptions at Yellowstone, the number for the interval would be about 730,000 years. Of course, the last eruption was 640,000 years. So the number 600,000 is more appealing if you're trying to build the case that somehow it's overdue. But second of all, here you're doing statistics based on a sample population of 2, the interval between the first and second, and the second and third large eruption at Yellowstone. Sample population of 2, not very big, not really statistically meaningful to talk about how often big eruptions occur at Yellowstone. And finally, in terms of this, there's no guarantee that Yellowstone will have another one of these super eruptions. Volcanoes have life cycles. They're born, they live their lives, they die. There are very few places that we can point to around the world that have had more than 3 very large eruptions. There is a remote possibility of those eruptions in the future. It's just a question of whether the kind of activity we're seeing now actually forecasts that anything is in the offing. But there's no reason to expect a big eruption at Yellowstone within our lifetime, which doesn't seem very worrying to me.
Why is Jake so sure? He thinks there is something the prophets of doom have overlooked.
Well, the way that Yellowstone has erupted most of the time is through these smaller lava flows, which are similar to those that happen in Hawaii, which, as you can imagine, would be locally very interesting, but not an international problem.
In the last 2 million years, the Yellowstone supervolcano has had 3 giant eruptions. Jake believes a crucial fact is preventing another one. Yellowstone erupts all the time, but on such a tiny scale, it produces nothing but harmless flows of lava.
Lava flows can block roads, forest fires might start, but they sort of roll very slowly across the ground. You could generally outrun them very easily, so they're not very damaging events.
Far from causing a disaster, Jake thinks these lava flows are keeping a lid on the sleeping giant.
Anytime that you're having a volcanic eruption, you're removing pressure on the magma chamber. It seems to be relatively commonplace for Yellowstone to have this kind of activity.
Are many eruptions at Yellowstone keeping us safe from the supervolcano? do they explain its recent rumblings?
Around 2009, 2010, we had a couple earthquake swarms. In a swarm, you have a number of medium-sized earthquakes, and they happen all in one particular location. They were among the larger ones that we've had.
But what caused the quakes? Scientists believe magma is flowing into the volcanic chamber, pushing up the crust. Is this a sign of an impending giant eruption?
It was about 25 centimeters or 10 inches, something like this, of uplift at Yellowstone. Between 1925 and 1975, it rose about 3 times that amount. So that uplift doesn't, in particular, seem very worrying to me. The kinds of activity we're seeing are the kind of activity that clearly has been going on for hundreds and even thousands of years.
Even if Jake is right, there's another burning question. Why are some people certain the Yellowstone supervolcano will erupt in 2012?
I think there's a subset of the population out there that just likes to be scared in a way. They like to come up with things that kind of stir the pot, but there's no clock beneath volcanoes that tells them when to erupt. Based on the information that we're seeing, there's no guarantee that Yellowstone will ever have another one of these super eruptions.
Were the ancient Mayans right? Will a supervolcano wipe out the human race in the greatest mass extinction since the Big Bang? Or is Yellowstone's sleeping giant nothing more than a harmless firecracker? Weird, or what?
Everywhere you look, our planet is teeming with life. Whether a single-celled amoeba, a snail, or incredibly complex organisms and species like us. But all life forms on Earth have one thing in common. Our very existence depends upon, in fact, is at the mercy of just one thing. If it's in trouble, then there's trouble for all of us.
They say you shouldn't stare directly into the sun. But for over 3 decades, NASA scientist David Hathaway has done exactly that. In 2005, he noticed something very strange.
It was a little unexpected by many of us, myself included.
Hathaway was tracking sunspots in giant regions of intense magnetic activity that occur on the surface of the sun. But the greatest danger to our planet is what explodes out of them: solar flares.
Solar flares can blast material off of the sun, a million miles an hour.
With a force of 10 billion atomic bombs, solar flares catapult billions of tons of red-hot plasma into space and sometimes directly at Earth.
When it strikes the Earth, can shape the Earth's magnetic field, does some spectacular things like produce aurora borealis, can also do things to our technology in particular. Solar flares can cause satellites to deorbit and ultimately re-enter the Earth's atmosphere and burn up, so you literally lose the satellite.
Solar flares and sunspots occur in regular cycles, but in 2008, Hathaway discovered something remarkable. Suddenly, they appeared to mysteriously stop.
We're seeing a sunspot cycle, the smallest we've seen in at least 100 years or perhaps 200 years. We didn't see sunspots for literally months at a time. That had us a little surprised.
Some scientists believe the change in the sunspot cycles is the calm before an unprecedented solar storm. A wave of solar flares so destructive, scientists call it Space Katrina. But now, other, ominous signs suggest the sun could be waking from its deep slumber.
We've gone from no sunspots to 20 or 30 sunspots on the sun on a given day now. We've also seen the number of flares increase.
Is there something wrong with the star that gives life to all things on Earth?
We've had some fairly wild predictions. You've got to go way back. You've got to go back to the 1600s to find the sun misbehaving or acting as weirdly as it is now.
Is our sun preparing to launch the biggest solar storm in history? A NASA scientist discovers strange activity in solar flares on the surface of the sun. Could a giant solar storm be coming our way? Or is there another explanation for the sun's weird behavior? Nassim Haramein is a scientist. He believes he has the answer. In 2009, he made a remarkable discovery when viewing images taken by a NASA satellite.
What I noticed is when I was looking at this, first of all, we see two objects appear. Those two objects seem to have moved together and have moved across the frame. What's strange about this particular sequence is that when you follow this object, they make almost a 90-degree angle turn and then entering the sun.
NASA claimed the objects were simply comets or glitches. But when Nassim studied them more closely, he came to an amazing conclusion.
And when I started to see these objects, I couldn't believe my eyes. They were immense. I mean, they only look like little dots on the data, but a little dot beside the sun means that the object is almost the size of the Earth.
Planet-sized objects entering the sun. Had Nassim found something extraordinary that even NASA had missed? He thinks there's only one explanation.
I believe these objects may be intergalactic ships from advanced civilization. They appear to be under intelligent control. They don't appear to act in a natural way that you would expect from, you know, cosmological objects like comets and meteorites and so on. It may sound completely outrageous, but imagine a civilization that's like thousands, if not millions of years ahead of us. Look at what we did in 150 years of advanced technology. We went from like literally horse and buggy to having rockets that are going to the moon and space shuttle and space stations and all this in 150 years. Imagine if we had 1,000 years of advancements in technology or 1,000,000 years in advancement. What would our ships look like? Well, they might be the size of planets.
Could this explain the sun's odd behavior? Are changes in its sunspot and solar flare activity being caused by alien ships?
The solar flare appears to emanate right after the objects impact the sun. To me, clear that the two are absolutely related, and the sun flare is most likely the shock wave resulting from the penetration of the objects through the surface of the sun.
Alien spacecraft deliberately crashing into the sun. It's an incredible theory, but why would they do it? According to Nassim, the answer lies in the astronomical records of the ancient Egyptians.
When I looked at all the data around the world from all these civilizations, they all talked about the sun gods. When you looked at these texts and the way they described them, they talked about the sun gods using the sun as a gateway. If you were an advanced civilization, and here I'm talking about a very advanced civilization, you could maybe enter and then come out at any other point in the universe. To me, after all these years, it has really become a fact of life. And I'm, not surprised anymore when people come up to me and say, when I was 10, I saw this object in the sky, or, a few months ago, I saw this amazing, object that could not be a plane and all this stuff. It's so common. So many people have seen it. And now there is governments that are releasing files that, from the military facilities, from extremely credible, sources. You're talking generals and all sorts of high-level military personnel coming forward, talking about this activity around the world. There is true phenomenon occurring that has to do with UFO activity and extraterrestrial activity, supporting this idea that maybe the sun gods are on their way back.
Is our sun part of an intergalactic highway being used by alien traffic? Are they responsible for disrupting its natural cycles and threatening the Earth?
Now, we did some pretty strange things on the Enterprise, but this is weird or what? Let me see if I got this straight. NASA scientists say our sun's sunspot cycles are behaving weirdly, and this could cause a giant killer solar flare to head towards Earth, right? While another guy, Nassim, thinks that there's something else causing these solar flares. He thinks aliens in spaceships the size of the Earth are crashing in and out of the sun, wreaking havoc. Nassim's theory seems crazy, right? Or is it?
Our sun is acting like an oddball. Are its natural cycles being disrupted by giant UFOs? Is a fatal solar storm on its way to Earth? NASA researcher David Hathaway has an explanation that's far more down to earth. He thinks we have nothing to worry about.
This recent sunspot cycle has started later than expected, and I think I understand it. The sunspot cycle is caused by magnetic fields. It's those magnetic fields that make the sunspots. And we've known for decades that it's the flows within the sun that take those magnetic fields, amplify them, and produce sunspots every 11 years. But the devil is in the details. Exactly what flows are there inside the sun that do this? What are the structure of those flows? And we're getting a better handle on that, but we're still not quite there yet. That we still really haven't got a model for how the sun does this, where we can take the equations and march them forward in time, the way a meteorologist might do with the equations for flows on in the Earth's atmosphere.
The sun's magnetic fields violently swirl around the surface like powerful ocean currents. They produce sunspots and solar flares until finally something bizarre happens.
The sun's magnetic field flips.
Every 11 years, the sun's magnetic poles do a backflip. Scientists believe this causes a dramatic decrease in sunspot and solar flare activity. But does it threaten us now?
We had weak magnetic fields produced on the surface of the sun during the last sunspot cycle. And because they were weak, we'll survive this without any major inconvenience.
The end of the worlders almost certainly have it wrong. The timing's just way off.
We may be safe for the moment, but could a mega solar storm hit us in the future? And what would happen if it did? Lawrence Joseph is a science journalist.
If a solar storm hit today, would knock us out, would knock civilization to its knees without any exaggeration.
How? An historical event could provide the answer. On September 1st, 1859, British astronomer Richard Carrington was looking through his telescope when a giant solar flare exploded onto the Earth.
It caused the northern lights to dance down to the equator. You could read a book at midnight outside because of the incredible radiation. The Carrington event caused some fires in telegraph offices and caused some disruption. But basically, it didn't inflict great damage.
Why didn't this massive flare destroy us?
There was no power grid holding society together. There was no telecom. There was none of the things that we've come to rely upon existed back then.
Joseph believes that if a similar solar flare hit us today, our massive reliance on electricity would be our downfall.
We're talking a blackout that could last months or years, could cover half to 2/3 of the continent. After a month, I can't really see anything but anarchy or the beginning of it. It's the paradox of progress, I call it. We have become more vulnerable to these storms, and the storms are headed our way. I mean, the shields are down, Scotty.
In 1989, a small solar flare knocked out the Quebec power grid and left 6 million people without power in the dead of winter. Joseph believes a giant flare would destroy every power grid on the planet. No electricity means no food.
I'm damn concerned people would really begin to die off in large numbers. So what are you going to do? We don't know. I mean, people go head for the hills. Well, what are you going to do in the hills? I don't know what to do in the hills. Most people don't.
Have our advances in technology made us vulnerable to a super solar storm? Is the sun's mysterious behavior natural, or are aliens to blame? Weird, or what? A world-renowned inventor makes an astonishing prediction.
20 years from now, computers will be operating fully at human levels.
Are we facing an uprising of killer machines? Could the Terminator be real?
It's incredible, isn't it? If we were to believe the ancient prophecies, or our modern-day doomsday theorists, or even some of our best scientists, then not only is the end of the world going to happen, but there's lots of ways that nature could destroy us. And none of them are nice. But what if they're all wrong? What if the thing that will wipe us out has nothing to do with volcanoes or solar storms? Or what if there's something, aside from nuclear weapons, of course, that we've created that's an even bigger threat? Weird. Or what?
In 1984, Hollywood gave the world a futuristic science fiction blockbuster. The story of a cyborg assassin sent back in time from 2029. The Terminator posed a remarkable question. Could robots take over and destroy us? Nearly 3 decades later, we may have the answer. Ray Kurzweil is a world-renowned inventor and futurist. He believes science fiction will become reality sooner than we think.
In the last 15 years, we've seen millions-fold improvement in the power of computers. And this is not just an idle speculation about the future, that's what we've seen. 20 years from now, computers will be operating fully at human levels.
It's an extraordinary theory based on an extraordinary fact. Today's computers are 100 billion times more powerful than they were a century ago. And their power is growing. Kurzweil believes they are rapidly catching us.
Computers already exceed humans at logical thinking, like playing games. There are robotic cars with artificial intelligence that are driving without human drivers A computer today can look at an electrocardiogram and diagnose it with the accuracy of doctors, and that's something that wasn't feasible even a couple of years ago. So things are moving more and more quickly.
Are we experiencing the rise of the machines? Are our PCs more than simply harmless pieces of plastic and metal?
They'll continue to grow exponentially in the basic hardware power, more than doubling in power every year. We'll get to human levels of intelligence in a machine by my estimates around 2029.
Wait a minute, what did you say?
We'll get to human levels of intelligence in a machine by my estimates around 2029.
2029 is the year from which the Terminator made its return. Will machines equal, then surpass our brain power in just 20 years? Incredibly, Kurzweil believes it won't end there.
By my calculations, when we get to around 2045, we will have multiplied the intelligence of our human-machine civilization a billion-fold by merging with this intelligent technology we're creating. That will be such a profound, singular transformation when we can actually vastly multiply our own intelligence.
Will man and machine merge before the middle of this century? And if so, what does it mean for us?
It's not an invasion, from another planet. And people say, oh, we'll lose our humanity. In my mind, that is our humanity. That's part of who we are. Our computers, our technology is part of the human civilization. So we will transcend our biology, not our humanity. I believe we will embody our human values in these machines. They're part of human civilization already. I don't like the term transhumanism because it implies that we're going to transcend our humanity. I think the goal, anyway, is to keep our humanity and transcend the limitations of our biology. And that's not a new story. If we hadn't done that, human life expectancy would still be 23, which is what it was 1,000 years ago.
Could our world end, not by natural disaster, but with humankind simply becoming obsolete? John Leslie is a professor of philosophy at the University of Guelph in Canada.
It could be in the next 20, 30 years, we have computers which are more intelligent than humans and which take over control of our lives. And there's an obvious possibility there that things could go badly wrong.
John believes that far from advancing humanity, creating uber-intelligent robots and computers could backfire on all of us.
If robots became super intelligent, they could well have very little interest in the human race. They could think of themselves as superior humans and look on us in the same way as we look on ants. And a machine could come to the answer, let's get rid of biological humans and put machines in place of them.
Are the machines we've created going to turn on us and take over our planet? Is Hollywood right?
You have to remember that the science fiction of today quite often turns out to be the science fact of tomorrow.
According to John, it's not only Terminators that pose a very real threat to our survival.
In fact, one of the dangers here is that it may be that computers are in charge of the system which controls nuclear bombs. We simply don't know to what extent they are in charge of the destructive forces.
Could a machine deliberately trigger a nuclear holocaust? It's a terrifying scenario. But Leslie has an even more frightening theory. The ultimate threat to the human race is already in our homes.
You could argue that the internet is, at present, a gigantic computer, and that its intelligence far exceeds the intelligence of any individual human. Certainly the amount of knowledge you can get very, very rapidly on the internet is much bigger than you could get by consulting the greatest memory experts. I believe that the future of the internet is pretty certainly going to push it in the direction of more and more intelligence.
Every day, over 2 billion people log on to the internet. It connects most of the world's computers and databases, moving information around the planet. John believes the internet could evolve into a central brain that leads a cybernetic revolt against mankind.
It could become immensely intelligent and become, therefore, what takes over world government, and possibly then decides that humans are irrelevant and gets rid of them. That's just one way in which we could be annihilated almost immediately.
Will robots blow us up with our own nuclear weapons? Is the internet going to destroy us? Will man be enslaved by machines?
You know, I never thought machines were that smart. I mean, most of the gadgets I have are incapable of doing anything useful at all, let alone reciting Shakespeare. But if we believe what some of the world's greatest minds are telling us, these things we've created are going to take us over, blow us up with our own weapons, and enslave us for the rest of time. Could that be possible? Not today, my friends.
Leading scientists believe machines are becoming so intelligent that they will overtake humans by 2050. Will they become Terminators and annihilate us? Noel Sharkey is a professor of artificial intelligence and robotics at the University of Sheffield, England. He says, we have nothing to worry about.
We're really a long way off at the moment of creating the kind of technology you see in the likes of the Terminator, with big humanoid robots armed with machine guns plodding across the battlefield.
Some of the world's greatest minds disagree, but Sharkey believes they haven't asked one simple question. Why?
And as a scientist, I need evidence, and there's no evidence of any kind of really smart intelligence or any kind of desire, or robots would have a desire to take over the world, any more than a washing machine would want to take over the world.
Not only does Sharkey think that machines aren't a threat, but they're not nearly as smart as we make them out to be.
A lot of people talk about artificial intelligence at the moment being at the level of the rat or the slug, and it's going to get so much smarter and be like the human later. But for me, I've studied animals all my life, really, and I would say that current robots weren't at the intelligence of a bacteria, because bacteria can feed themselves and they know how to survive. Robots don't. They're dependent on me. And essentially, they're not bright enough to be called stupid.
But even if robots and computers are nothing more than digital dummies, couldn't someone use them for evil rather than good?
Well, the problem is that robots are very limited in what they can do. You just program a robot, but it's all up to what the programmer puts in there. There's no reason why the robot themselves would do anything that we haven't told them to do. And I certainly wouldn't be programming a robot to tell it to take over the world, and I don't think anybody else would.
Instead of creatures with a superintelligence that surpasses humans, Sharkey thinks machines are our moronic slaves that lack the one essential ingredient for a robot-led Armageddon: human emotion.
We have consciousness, and we use that in our everyday lives, in our thought, in our desires. Whereas robots have a really rigid silicon intelligence, no desires, no wants.
But if robots have neither the brains nor the drive for world domination, why do so many others believe it will happen?
The whole idea of a robot takeover is quite odd, and it's really the subject of science fiction. Right back since the word was invented in 1921, all science fiction movies have been about robots killing humans and taking over the world. But it is, as it says, fiction. One of my big concerns at the minute is that there are 43 countries worldwide that are developing military robots. And one of the problems is the military seem to have this idea, science fiction idea of robots, that they could be have that kind of intelligence. But in actual fact, they can't tell the difference between a soldier and a civilian. And so a lot of people will die. But it won't be through the intentions of robots. It'll be through the misuse by humans of a dangerous weapon.
Are robots just mindless heaps of metal? all will man and machine merge and destroy the human race? We'll just have to wait and find out. Weird or what? So there we have it. Doomsday stories from the Earth and beyond. In Wyoming, a deadly supervolcano lies dormant. Will it explode in 2012 and fulfill a Mayan prophecy? In Alabama, a NASA scientist discovers the unthinkable. A giant solar storm could be on its way to destroy the Earth. And one of the world's greatest minds makes a startling prediction. Man and machine will merge by 2050. Will robots take over? Are we facing a Terminator Armageddon? Are these stories evidence that the end of the world is nigh? Can we dismiss those who claim these things are true? You decide.
Join me again next time for more stories that will undoubtedly be weird or what?